Good morning, Room 19. I'm happy to continue the miraculous journey of Edward Tulane. We are now on chapter 19. The days passed, the sun rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy and he did not care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled, and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death, and it felt good. In the evenings at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month she refused to eat, and in the 6th month she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember, in between breaths, what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey," Bryce stood over her and said. "Breath," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please, please, breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap, and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh no," said Bryce. "Oh, honey, take a little breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her, and now she is gone." How could this be, he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. "She ain't yours," Bryce screamed. "You can't take her. She ain't yours." But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself. And then finally, the boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." And that concludes this chapter.